Welcome to another Partners in Crime tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be making shockwaves in Blender. So we wanted to make these shockwaves look as much like Video Copilot shockwaves as possible by using Blender's smoke simulator, since Video Copilot shockwaves looked a lot like wispy smoke. But since our computer can handle 10 million smoke particles, we're going to make a 3D object our shockwave. So we're going to shape our 3D object, give it a special material, and add some more organic movement before jumping into the compositor and giving it some finesse. So this is what you should get when you finish our tutorial, and without further ado, let's get started. The first thing you want to do is delete the default cube by pressing X on your keyboard and then clicking delete. Next, press numpad 1 on your keyboard to go into front view, and then to bring the camera to front view, press Ctrl and then Alt and then press numpad 0 on your keyboard. Now we're going to add the 3D object that's going to be our shockwave. So go into the top left of the screen here and click on the Create tab. And we're going to make a torus our shockwave. So just left click on torus to add a torus. And now in the middle of the screen here, I'm going to type R and then X and then 90 on my keyboard. And press enter to confirm that rotation. So now we've got our torus facing us. So let's size this up a bit by pressing S on our keyboard and just moving our cursor out, just making this a little bit bigger. Left click to confirm the sizing. So now we can start shaping our object so that it looks more like a shockwave. So let's go into the right of the screen here and go into the modifiers tab. Click add modifier, and we're going to add a displacement modifier. So click displace and click new to add a new texture for our torus to displace to. Now let's go into the texture settings by moving our cursor up here and scrolling through, and left click on the texture settings tab and change the texture type from image or movie to clouds. And now let's just go back into the modifiers tab and apply this modifier. So hit apply. So now we've got a pretty nice shockwave shape here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull some of the vertices of this shockwave towards the center and make it sort of just look like our shockwave is popping out. So to do that, I'm going to add a warp modifier to our shockwave. So let's go into the right of the screen here and click add modifier and click warp. Now we're going to need some objects for our warp modifier. So I'm going to add a sphere and a torus. So I'm going to go into the left of the screen here and click UV sphere to add a UV sphere, and click on torus to add a torus. And now I'm going to right click on our torus here, and I'm going to warp this from the sphere we've added to the torus we've added, which I think the torus we added is named torus 001. So let's click the from box in the right of the screen here and select sphere. And in the to box, click that and select torus 001. So now to see the effect of our warp modifier, we're going to have to right click on our torus 001 and size that. So right click on it and press S on your keyboard and move your cursor up. And you can see it's just pulling some of those faces towards the center, towards this torus that we're sizing here. So let's left click to confirm that sizing, and now use your middle mouse button to pan around. And we're just going to pull this torus back. So left click on this green arrow here, hold that and just pull that back. So now it just sort of looks like our shockwave is popping out towards the camera. So let's turn off the rendering for the torus and the sphere right here, since we don't want these objects to show up in our render. So let's go to the top left, top right of the screen here and scroll until you see the sphere and the torus. So left click on the digital camera icon next to sphere and left click on the digital camera icon next to torus 001. And that'll turn off the rendering for those two objects. So now we're going to go back into camera view by pressing numpad 0 on our keyboard. Scroll down to zoom out here. I'm going to right click on our shockwave here. And I'm just going to bring up this menu by typing in on my keyboard. I'm going to name this shockwave. So click on that box there and type shockwave. Left click there and press N to exit that box there. So now I'm going to just apply this warp modifier. So hit apply there. Now I've got the warp modifier applied. I'm going to add in a remesh modifier. So let's click add modifier, remesh, and I'm going to put the octree depth up to 5. Right? It's looking pretty good. So hit apply to apply that remesh modifier. Now what that did was it got rid of some of those long faces that were in these areas where my cursor is. And it's just sort of making them all around the same size. So I'm going to hit tab to delete some of these faces. Tab to go in edit mode. And I'm going to go into face select mode at the bottom of the screen here. And I'm going to put my cursor in the center of the screen here. And press C to bring up circle select. Now scroll down to zoom up this circle select. And just left click to select these faces. Now I'm going to right click to exit circle select. And press X on my keyboard. And once the delete dialog pops up, click faces. And that just deleted those faces here. So now that we have more faces on the outer edges here, and lesser faces towards the inners. So using my middle mouse button to pan around, I'm just going to take a look at how a shockwave looks. Alright, so I'm going to add in another warp modifier that's going to just pull some of these faces back again. So back in the camera view with numpad 0. I'm going to press tab to exit edit mode. And I'm going to click add modifier and click warp. Warp it from sphere to torus 001 again. Sphere to torus 001. I'll change the radius to 1.4 and pull the strength to 0.4. Now I'm going to use my middle mouse button to pan around again and take a look. So this shockwave is looking pretty nice. I'm going to use numpad 0 to go back in the camera view, and I'm going to go into the world settings and make the background for my scene black before finally rendering this shockwave. So let's go into the world settings. Click on the horizon box and drag this down to black. So let's render this to see how it looks. So F12. So you can see our shockwave is looking pretty solid. We want it to look sort of like wispy, smoky energy. So I'm going to add in a special material to this to make it look like energy. So let's go back into 3D view. And let's go into the material sections to the right of the screen here. And click new to add a new material. Now I'm going to make the material a halo material. And I'll put the size of this to 0.02, 0.25 maybe. And I'll put the alpha down to something low. Let's go with 0.0009. Right? So now we're going to add in, use my middle mouse button to pan around. We're going to add in a few more modifiers before we render this out. So press numpad 0 to go back into camera view and go into the modifiers tab. I'm going to just add a subdivision surface modifier to add a few more faces and sort of just neaten out our shockwave there. So click add modifier, subdivision surface, change the render to 4. And I'm going to add in one more displacement modifier that's just going to scrunch up our shockwave a bit. So let's click add modifier and let's go with displace. And click new to add a new texture. And we're going to bump the strength of this texture down to 0.1. And I'll move this up so that our subdivision surface modifier neatens out our displace modifier. I'm going to pull this out so you can all see. So now I'm going to go into the texture settings and click this here and select our displace texture 001. I'm going to change the texture type from image or movie to clouds, and let's click colors here. I'm going to check ramp and I'm going to just flip this around here. Scroll down. Let's change the basis for our clouds displacement from Blender Original to Voronoi F4. So click on that box and select Voronoi F4. Right, so we've got this should give our shockwave a nice kind of fractal sort of shape. So use my middle mouse button to pan around. Our shockwave is looking pretty good, and I think it's time for a render. So back into camera view with numpad 0, and then you can press F12 on your keyboard or go into the top left of the screen and click render, and then click render image, like so. So this is a pretty nice kind of energetic looking shockwave here. So let's go back into 3D view. Since we've got our shockwave to look the way we want it to look, we're now going to make it move the way we want it to move. So let's go back into camera view. I'm going to make this sort of just pop out like a shockwave should. To do that, I'm going to insert a couple of scaling keyframes. So let's jump to frame 10. And I want it to be about, I'll press S and move my cursor in. Left click. It'll be about this size on frame 10, so press I to bring up the insert keyframe menu, and then click scaling to insert a scaling keyframe. Now I'm going to jump back to frame 1, and I'm going to size this shockwave all the way down to 0. So press S on your keyboard and then type 0 and then press enter. And now I'm going to press I on my keyboard, and once the insert keyframe menu dialog pops up, click scaling. So now from frame 1 to 10 our shockwave is just going to pop out. So let's click play to see how this looks. Alright, so now we want it to slowly get bigger after it pops into the screen there. So I'm going to jump to we'll go to frame 100. And I'm going to make this get a little bit bigger. So size that, S on your keyboard, and move your cursor out. Move your cursor out there. And I want it just within camera boundaries. So that should be good. Left click to confirm the sizing. Now press I to bring up the insert keyframe menu again, and left click on scaling. So now from frame 1 to 10 our shockwave is going to pop into the screen, and from frame 10 to 100 it's just going to slowly get bigger. So let's jump to frame 0 and click play so you can see how this looks. So it's looking pretty nice. Pops out and it slowly gets bigger. So I'm going to hit pause on this. I'm going to change the end frame of this to 100. And now that we've got our shockwave scaling animated, we're going to start giving it some of that organic movement. To do that, we're going to adjust the physics settings. So let's go into the right of the screen here and click the physics tab, and make sure you have your shockwave selected once you do this. And we're going to enable physics for soft body. So left click on that. And what this is useful for is if you say wanted to make something like jello or something flow, like maybe a flag or something. I think the cloth simulator would be a bit better for flags, but for what we need, soft body will be adequate. So let's start adjusting the settings for this. I'm going to put the friction to 0.3. And let's click on the arrow next to soft body goal. I'm going to change the default, the minimum, and the maximum all to 0.3. and we're going to adjust the stiffness. Now this is going to help our object retain its shape. If we put this to a higher setting, our shockwave will be really stiff and not be affected like by force fields or anything. And if we put this, I'm going to press numpad 0 all the way down to 0, our shockwave would likely fall all over itself if we added a force field. So what I'm going to do is just put the stiffness up a bit to say 0.7. So that way it'll keep its shape mostly, but still be affected by whatever force fields we'll add later. So now I'm going to adjust soft body fill weights. We don't want our shockwave to just drop off the screen here. So we're going to turn off gravity for it. So in the bottom right of the screen here, drag that down to 0. And let's go to soft body edges. Right? So what these pull and push values are for is if you say wanted to make an elastic sort of object, like a rubber band or something. But since we don't want our shockwave to behave like a rubber band, we're just going to turn those off. So click on those boxes and put them to 0. And let's put the bending up to 0.01. Scroll through here. I'm going to put the damping over here. Click this box. Let's put that up to 10. All in all, our shockwave is looking pretty good. Now to give it some organic kind of turbulent movement like a shockwave, I'm going to add in a force field. So let's press Shift A on our keyboard. Shift and then A. And once the add dialog pops up, go down to force field and click on turbulence. We're just going to put the strength of this up to 3. So now we have created a shockwave and added a soft body physics to it so that it will be affected by our force field that we've just added. So we can now play this animation and see the organic movement that we should have. So Alt A. Alright, do that again. Wait for it. Alright. So now it's nice and flowing like energy. All it's a pretty good look. So let's hit pause on this. I'm gonna right click on this on our shockwave. I'm just gonna move this around a bit. G, right click, and just pull that back there. I'm gonna bake the physics settings that we've got here. So let's go to soft body cache and change the end to 100 since the end frame of our whole scene is 100. Let's put that to 100. And now you can hit bake all dynamics and just wait for that to finish baking. And now that that's finished baking, we can now play our animation to see how it looks. So we've got that nice, energetic, sort of flowing shockwave. So I'm going to hit pause on this and jump to a random frame. Alright, frame 50 should be good. And I'm now going to hit F12 to render this. So that is our nice wispy kind of fractal energy shockwave there. So now that we've finished making our shockwave and adding some organic movement to it, we can now add some cool glow effects in the compositor. So let's jump into the compositor to the top of the screen here. And check use nodes and check backdrop and just move these nodes around here. I'll scroll down to zoom out, and I'm going to add output viewer and hook the output of the render layers node to the image input of the viewer. So now you can see our shockwave in the background there. So the first node I'm going to add that's going to really edit the shockwave will be a color correction node. And that's just going to help us adjust the tones in our shockwave. So let's click add and then color correction and hook it up after our render layers node. Now I'm going to scroll up to zoom in so you can all see the settings that I'm going to use for this color correction node. Now the first thing I'm going to adjust will be the gamma shadows. So let's put that at 0.82. Alright, so let's darken some of the darker areas of our shockwave there. Now I'm going to adjust the, let's see, we'll go with the master gain. Let's put that up to 3. Bring some brightness back in our shockwave. Alright, so that's looking pretty nice. I'm going to scroll down to zoom out. Use my middle mouse button to pan around. Now the next node that I'm going to add is going to make our shockwave kind of just pop out and be sort of wispy. And it will be a directional blur node. So let's add filter and click directional blur and hook it up after our color correction node. And change the number of iterations to 3. And now get the wispy pop out effect. Let's put the zoom up to 0.02. Right? So you can see, got a wispy kind of pop out effect there. Scrolling down to zoom out here. I'm just gonna organize these nodes a bit before I start adding a few more. Gonna get a little crowded over here. So now I'm gonna start adding some glow effects. And to do that, I'm going to add some glare nodes. So click add, filter, glare, and hook our glare node up after our directional blur node. And change the glare type from streaks to fog glow, and change the quality from medium to high. And let's pull the threshold down to 0. And I'm going to add a bit more of a glow, so I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate this glare node and just hook that up there. Alright, so now I'm going to scroll down to zoom out here. I'm going to click add color mix. I'm just going to hook it up here. Scroll up to zoom in. I'm going to change the type from mix to add. Make it an add node. And let's just add in our shockwave that doesn't have the glow effects applied here to the shockwave that does have the glow effects. So it's our glow effects there, and this is without glow effects, and this is just adding those together. Gonna pull these nodes out now. So that's looking really nice there. I'm gonna scroll up to zoom in again. So now I'm going to add in a color balance node to adjust the color of the shockwave. So click add, color, color balance, and hook it up after our add node. And I'm going to make the shockwave blue. So in the lift section here, I'm going to left click and hold to just pull this dot up here. And wait for that to composite. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. Use my middle mouse button to pan around and scroll up to zoom in. Now I'm going to just add a node that's going to make the brighter areas of the shockwave really pop out. So I'm going to add in a luminance key node. So let's click add matte luminance key and hook it up after our color balance node. We're going to hook the matte output of the luminance key to the image input of the viewer. And we're just going to wait for that to composite, right? And the high to something low, like let's go 0.02. Scroll down to zoom out. And you can see these brighter areas are really just popping out more. Alright, now I'm going to use my middle mouse button to pan around. Scroll up to zoom in. So now that we've sort of overrode the blue color that we put here, I'm going to add in an RGB curves node that's going to bring some color back into our shockwave. So let's click Add, Color, RGB Curves, and hook this up after our luminance key. Now I think I'm going to make the shockwave orange now, so to do that I'm going to lower the blue levels and heighten the red levels. So let's go into the blue levels, then lower those, and go into the red levels and heighten those. This should give our shockwave a nice orangish color. Alright, so let's move these nodes around again. So now what we're going to do is sort of just keep the darker tones in our shockwave minimized. So I'm going to add in a color correction node. So click Add, Color, Color Correction, and hook it up after our RGB curves node. Now let's scroll up to zoom in here, and I'm going to use my middle mouse button to pan around. So now let's start adjusting the settings on this color correction node. First thing I'm going to adjust is this highlight setting right here. Put it up to 2.13. And let's put the shadow gamma on this to 0.47. Get those dark tones darker. Alright, so that is looking pretty nice. Let's go up to zoom in. Alright, so let's adjust a few more settings. I'm going to adjust the master gamma, put that to 0.65. Let's go down to zoom out. Okay. And I think we're pretty much done adjusting the settings for this color correction node. I'm going to add in a few more nodes since our shockwave is looking pretty contrasty. So the next node I'm going to add will be a blur node. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to screen this shockwave over a blurry version of it. So let's click Add, Filter, Blur to add in a blur node. Scroll up to zoom in and change the blur type from Gaussian to Fast Gaussian. And make the X blur 98 and the Y blur 88. Use my middle mouse button to pan around. Now I'm going to click Add, Color Mix, and hook it up right here. I'm going to change it from Mix to Screen. And let's hook the output of our color correction node to the input of the blur node. And let's hook the output of the blur node to the bottom input of the screen node. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to put the factor of this down to 0.2. Okay, and now I'm going to add in a sharpen node. So let's click Add, Filter, Filter. Change type from Soften to Sharpen. And let's hook that up right there and see what effect our sharpen node has on our shockwave. Okay, so that's a little bit too much sharpening, so I'm going to put that down to 0.1. Okay, and I'm going to duplicate this green node right here. Left click on that. Shift D to duplicate. And I'm gonna add in the output of the color correction node to the input of the screen node here. Okay, so now we've got a pretty energetic orange shockwave here. I'm wanna easily change the color of this later on, so I'm gonna add in a hue saturation value node. So click Add Color Hue Saturation Value and hook it up after our screen node, and just pull the saturation down to 0. So now that our shockwave is desaturated, it's going to be a lot easier to change the color of it using an RGB curves node. Now, we want our shockwave to sort of fade out at a certain frame, so we'll make this a dual purpose hue saturation value node here. We're going to use this node for our fade out. So let's jump to a frame that we want our shockwave to start fading out on. So I'm going to jump to frame, let's go with frame 67. So on the bottom right of the screen here, click this box here and type 67. I'm going to hover my cursor over this and press I to insert a keyframe for the value. So now our shockwave will start fading out at frame 67, and let's make a frame that our shockwave will finish fading out on. So let's jump to frame 80, and we'll make our shockwave disappear. So drag that down to 0 on frame 80. So hover your cursor over that and press I to insert the keyframe for that. So now from frame 67 to frame 80, our shockwave will fade out, like it's dissipated. So let's wait for this to composite. Alright, move these nodes around here. Let's say you wanted to add a background for your shockwave. Well, I would screen my shockwave over in the image node. So left click on the screen node here and press shift to duplicate it. Hook it up there and put the factor up to 1. And we'll put this in the bottom input of the screen node. And I'm going to add in that image background. So click Add, Input Image, and I'll include a link for the image that I'm going to be using in the description below. Put that up there. And let's open an image. I'm going to use GText Dark Blue and click Open Image. And let's hook the image output to the top input of this screen node. So now you can see our shockwave over our background. Let's scale our background to our rendered scene size. So let's click Add, Distort, and click Scale and hook it up after the image node here and change the scaling from relative to render size. Use my middle mouse button to pan around. Now I want a little bit more glow on my shockwave, so I'm going to add in another glare node. Or scroll down to zoom out and find one of the ones I've already got around here. Use my middle mouse button to pan around. Let's see, left click on this glare node here and press Shift D to duplicate it. Use your middle mouse button to pan around. Scroll up to zoom in. And hook this glare node up after our hue saturation value node. Scroll up to zoom in. You see that? Make our shockwave kind of an electric blue. So I'm going to add in an RGB curves node. Add color RGB curves. and hook it up after the glare node. And since I want an electric blue shockwave, I will lower the red levels on this and heighten the blue levels. So let's go into the red levels and lower the red levels, and go into the blue levels and heighten the blue levels. Use my middle mouse button to pan around. Now that is a nice looking shockwave. We've now got our shockwave created with our organic movement, and we've also got the fade out animated. And make sure to hook the output of the screen node to the input of the composite node. So now we've pretty much finished making our shockwave, but before this tutorial is over, I'm going to show you guys some advanced tips on how to customize the shockwave. So you can sculpt and maybe even use some dynamic topology to put some fine tuning on the shape of the shockwave. And you can also change the types of textures used for the displacement modifiers. Also, you can add different geometry modifiers, like maybe the simple deform or the cast ones, to further customize the shape. And in the compositor, you can adjust the RGB curves or the hue saturation value nodes to change the colors of the shockwaves. And you can also change the force fields and the values of their effects in the physics settings. All in all, there's a bunch of cool stuff you can do with this to customize it to your liking. And you'll probably be seeing this effect or something like it in a lot of our templates. So now we're pretty much finished making this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for the next tutorial from Partners in Coordinated Rendering of Ideas, Motion, and Effects.